Hello, today I'll present to you this slightly older SATA SSD, the Kingston SSDNow 300V, the 16 gigabyte drive capacity. This SSD has been used for some years on an installation. However, I wanted to show you a short video so that you know if you happen to find such a drive on the second-hand market or even new old stock, if it's worth or not for older applications. First of all, I have to begin by saying that this drive was quite good when it was released. Previously, I know of another Kingston drive that didn't quite have good performance and endurance, and this meant that the performance was quite abysmal in certain situations. However, this drive I think has a quite good performance. I estimate it to be released around 2017, so it's already a bit old, but on the other hand, I think it has enough performance. I will show you the drive as it looks. This is the package in which it came. Now the drive itself. It's a typical Kingston drive, packaged in quite a solid metal housing, so I think it has very good survivability on most installations. It doesn't seem to get hot during use, so heat sinking is plenty for those situations. You have your standard SATA connector, and I think that just about sums up. The drive feels quite heavy, I must say. So if you have some sort of applications where the weight could be quite an important factor, or there are other issues pertaining to the strength of the mounting, you have to take into account that this drive is quite hefty. It's nothing bad about it, but you have to take into account that it's much heavier than Samsung drives of the same era. I don't think the housing is made of aluminium. I think it's made of metal, or it seems to be metal, but not aluminium. I'm not entirely sure what kind of metal it is. Could be some sort of specially coated iron alloy. I'm not entirely sure, but however, it is very heavy for such a drive. It's not quite far from some hard drives you may encounter. So this is an important thing you have to take into account. All right. I will show you in the next section some details about the benchmarks I made and some closing remarks. But this is how the drive ultimately looks. It's quite stylish, especially if you have an older application where it could be showcased. It has the typical side mounted and lower side mounting screws, so it can accommodate any sort of mounting. This is actually typical. I'm not talking about anything special about the drive. The only thing to note is that this drive has been available in capacities that could go up to I think almost 500 gigabytes, 480 gigabytes. This drive was quite uncommon. It was the lowest tier drive that has been released in the SSDNow 300V series, and not many benchmarks have been made available on the internet, but I think this just about sums up what you can expect. I'm not saying it's a bad drive, far from that. I think it's a quite good drive. Unfortunately, I could not find at least, especially now, more information. So let's go to the benchmarks. Moving on, I thought about showing you the datasheet details that Kingston provided with the drive. I think it looks quite competitive from a performance point of view. The only disadvantage, as I see right now, is the fact that I could not find any specification for the 60 gigabyte drive. However, based on prior experience, I can clearly assume that the read and write performance is going to be lower than on higher capacity drives, most of all because the writing and reading can be spread between multiple cells, and generally lower capacity drives have just fewer cells of a similar capacity. And I assume the same performance can be probably said about the number of operations per second that can be carried out. I can also assume, but you can hardly see those informations in most catalogs, the fact that smaller capacity drives also have a lower power consumption. But in general, I don't consider this to be quite important, as values between 0.6, as is mentioned over here, and 2 watts I think are overly low. Probably those values are greatly in line. They are quite difficult to measure, so I'm not really confident about that. And of course the fact that most of the time I can expect a drive to be an SSD drive to require less current than your typical hard drive. Alright, so looking at the values, it is said over here that all capacities using the auto test, I don't know exactly what kind of test is being carried out, it can reach 450 megabytes for reads and writes. I think this is more of a theoretical benchmark, because in practice with a SATA 3 drive you can never achieve such values, and especially the values for reads and writes are always different. So I think it's quite a synthetical benchmark that it's pointless for most circumstances. The next benchmark, however, I think is quite interesting. It's a crystal disk benchmark, crystal disk mark result that I think we can relate to. It is said over here that over 100 megabytes per second and 153 megabytes per second in the case of writes can be achieved with the drive. I don't expect the values to be as such, whether trim is available or not, most of the time, because I'm not entirely sure if those values are probably during more, let's say, stressing conditions like temperature, or after some writes, because in general when a burst of writes occur for a couple of minutes, the performance is going to get lower. So probably baseline performance in this case could be about the worst performance that the manufacturer is going to guarantee. So I think these are the values. The rest of the information is quite typical. In general, modern SSD drives have better read and write performance, especially when talking about random reads and writes. Alright, without further ado, let's see what we found out during the test. As you can probably see quite well from this image, I think that the values are higher for reads than the ones that the manufacturer specified. On the other hand, writes are clearly lower than the values the manufacturer mentioned in the datasheet. This is quite typical. Okay, another information, you may probably see the fact that the drive's capacity partition that was used is 43 gigabytes, or 47 if you're talking about unformatted size. This in general doesn't have too much of an influence. Of course, due to spreading of writes, you can probably assume that the performance would be slightly better if the partition covers the entire drive, but as far as I can tell, this is a very minimal influence. In general, the performance in reading and writing stays roughly the same with a drive that is partitioned in two split data areas, or it's in a single one. So I consider this value to be quite reasonable for these purposes. Getting back to the details, I think that the random performance, the lower two rows are going to be the most, let's say, unfortunate result, but this is quite to be expected. We are not talking about a high performance drive, and since 2017 2016 so much has been done even for SATA SSD drives. So I'm not thinking that this performance is too bad. A typical hard drive, a mechanical hard drive, can probably reach around, I think, a third of this performance, especially for random reads and writes, while the sequential writes performance, I think, is higher, especially for 7200 RPM drives. So overall, I think it's a good SSD, especially for retro applications or for vintage purposes, as an upgrade for another computer that is not going to be used a lot, especially when we're thinking about the previous generation of computers that, well, previous generation, actually quite an old generation of computers from roughly the same timeline, something manufactured between 2015 2018. I think it's not going to be a drag on the system, and especially for all the computers, probably ones that have been released since have been released around 2008. I think it's a very good upgrade compared with your typical hard drive. While the unit doesn't have a high capacity, I think it's quite fine. On the other hand, I also wanted to show to you the typical hard drive map, because I think it's telling when a drive has been used for some years on a Windows XP machine, and you can roughly expect this kind of let's say wearing out of the memory cells. So besides, I think, one or two at most cells, as they are showing over here, probably not cells but an array of cells, they have very low use, and I think that the drive had less than 1 terabyte of writes, so it's clearly much lower than the limit as mentioned in the datasheet. So I think it's quite a good drive. I have tested it on an USB 3 to SATA adapter. I think an even better performing drive can have faster results, so I don't think at all that it's being in any way limited by the adapter. Probably your typical let's say internal system mounting with a SATA interface going directly to your motherboard or another adapter is going to have slightly higher performance, but I think those values are typically along the line, especially when you think about let's say the random read and random write performance, because those values in general are the ones that are going to have the most impact on how you feel the system, because sequential writes are going to be quite uncommon, especially for larger arrays of data. Very rarely you can probably transfer so much information in such a little time. So I think the drive is quite good. Probably slightly better than the first generation of the Samsung SSD drives, the 830 SATA drives. I'm quite sure about that. But on the other hand, there are drives such as the Intel SSD, early Intel SSD drives that I think are having similar or even better performance. So the controller is not bad. The drive's endurance is fine for most purposes, especially when disk writes are not very high due to very large swap files. But I think the drive is a very good choice, especially if you find it for a low price. I don't know, something less than $25 or euros. I think it's a very good price, and I think it can be used for quite some years. I thought about sharing with you this information, and I hope it's interesting, and you find many other videos that you're going to enjoy on the YouTube channel. So thank you very much for watching, and have a good day.